Good morning. It's time for some Monday book talks. I read a couple books last week, but I literally only read one from this library last week. But I'm going to talk about a couple of them. The first of which is The Last Days of Barcelona by Chanel Cleeton. I love everything that she writes. She writes mostly historical fiction, and her books are about an exiled family from Cuba. So they live in Palm Springs. That action takes place in Cuba and Florida. This one took place in part in Spain and drew a really great connection between the dictatorship in Cuba and the dictatorship in Spain. I actually didn't know until very recently that even post-World War II, Spain was ruled by a dictator, and it was awful. It was an awful place to be, and they didn't get any measure of freedom for a very long time. And so this book covers a little bit of that. The series is about a set of sisters, the Perez sisters, whose parents left Cuba right after Castro took over and moved to Florida, trying to give their girls a better life. And there's one book about each sister, and then there are a couple of books that predate the sisters that are about their grandmother and their aunts. Anyway, if you like historical fiction, they're an amazing set of books. Like, Next Year in Havana, When We Left Cuba, Last Days in Barcelona. They're great. So, another book that I read is book 3 of this series. So, American Worlds is 1, Majesty is 2, and I just read Rivals. And the premise of that is that instead of electing Washington president, they crowned him king. And so all of the descendants of Washington have been in charge of America since then. Otherwise, it's normal modern day. There's same things that happen, the paparazzi, the cell phones, the private schools. It's an interesting twist. I thought that there were just 2 books, and I was really shocked to see a third. And I was like, yes, put it in my hands. And then it felt really much like a placeholder, because apparently there's at least a 4th book. I don't know how many more there are, but there's at least 4, because number 3 ends on the same cliffhanger that number 1 ends on. It seemed very weird. Wasn't great, but get away from the next one. The first 2 are really good, and I really think you probably could just read the first 2 and call it a day, but I like the alternative reality of it. I also read a book by Jana Evanovich, and I know I talk about her every time she has a new book because I just really like her. She writes the One for the Money, and she has a heist series about FBI agents, but she has a brand new character who is a recovery agent. That's actually the name of the book. And what she does is find treasures, sometimes lost ancient treasures, and sometimes just like, there was this ring that I had insured and I'm pretty sure it got stolen. Can you find it? And so I really did enjoy that book. We have some other stuff by her if you want to check it out. And then the last book I'm going to talk about was the best book that I read, Unspeakable, a book about the Tulsa Race Massacre by Carole, Weatherford, and Floyd Cooper is the illustrator. I have read recently multiple books about the Tulsa Race Massacre because I didn't know enough about it. So I've read a fiction book and a nonfiction book. I'm reading a 3rd fiction book right now, and this is a nonfiction book, and it's beautifully drawn. It's so pretty. What's interesting is you can tell it's not super wordy. There's not 1,000 words on every page, and yet I actually learned things from this book that I did not read in the full-size nonfiction book that I read. If you don't know anything about it and you haven't heard any of my other book talks, I will say that the Tulsa Race Massacre happened in 1921, and it happened in a suburb of Tulsa called Greenwood, which was very much a wealthy, Black-owned, lived neighborhood. They had everything that the other side of Tulsa, on the other side of the tracks, had. They had an 800-seat movie theater. They had a barbershop, they had a furrier, they had a dress shop, they had flower shops, they had a full-size high school, they had a second smaller theater. There were tons of houses, Black doctors, Black lawyers, Black nurses, Black teachers. It was a very prosperous place for Black people to live in 1921. But as so much happened in that era and sadly still happening today. One tiny incident of a black man tripping into an elevator and the white elevator attendant screaming out from surprise started a riot. Riot's probably not the right word, because it wasn't as though it was a two-sided fight. Within a couple of days, 800 homes were burned, businesses were burned, 300 people were dead, and so many people were homeless. And rebuilding was so hard because the insurance companies claimed that because it was a riot, that they brought it on themselves. So that is the Tulsa Race Massacre, and we have multiple books you can read about it if you'd like to learn more, including this amazing children's book, which tells a great story in a very limited amount of words. Hope you guys have a good week.